She went for a bike ride on Mother's Day and never came home. Her husband told police he had no idea what happened. He went in front of cameras. He pleaded for tips. He cried. He asked for his wife to be returned safely. And for a while, a long while, a lot of people believed him. But investigators were building a different picture. And at the center of that picture was a single obscure veterinary drug, one that, in the entire surrounding region of Colorado, only one private citizen was known to have purchased. One person, one prescription, one name. Barry Morphew. This is the story of what allegedly happened before sunrise on a spring morning in the Colorado mountains, why it took over 3 years to find the truth, and how a man who walked free from a murder charge ended up living under a fake name in Arizona, right up until the moment law enforcement came knocking. Stay with me, because this case has more twists than almost anything I've ever covered. And some of the details are going to genuinely make your jaw drop. To understand this story, you first need to picture the place where it happened. Salida, Colorado, is not a city. It's a small mountain community tucked deep into the heart of the Rockies, the kind of town that attracts people who are done with traffic and noise and the relentless pace of urban life. People move to Salida to slow down, to hike, to mountain bike, to breathe clean air and raise kids somewhere that still feels like the America you see on postcards. Barry and Suzanne Morphew moved there in 2018, relocating from Indiana. Barry worked in landscaping and construction. Suzanne was a devoted mother to their 2 daughters and had recently gotten into mountain biking, a sport that fit perfectly with life in a town surrounded by world-class trails and stunning terrain. They had a beautiful home. By all outward appearances, they were exactly the kind of family that thrives in a place like Salida. And then came Mother's Day, May 10th, 2020. Suzanne headed out that morning for a bike ride. This wasn't unusual. She rode regularly, knew the trails, and loved being out on the mountain. Her husband Barry had already left the house before daybreak. He told police he had a large landscaping job near Denver, more than 2 hours away, and he wanted to get an early start. Their daughters were both out of town that weekend, so the house was quiet. And for a while, that was fine. But hours passed, and Suzanne didn't come home. By evening, one of their daughter's boyfriends had driven to the Morphew house after the family couldn't reach Suzanne by phone. What he found when he arrived set off an immediate sense of unease. Suzanne's car was still sitting in the garage. Her mountain bike, which she almost always carried in the back of her vehicle when she went for rides, was gone. She was nowhere in the house. And her phone had stopped showing activity. He called law enforcement. When deputies arrived and swept the property, they found nothing to indicate a struggle, no forced entry, no broken glass, no obvious signs of a crime having been committed on the premises. What they found instead was a trail that started less than a mile away. Suzanne's mountain bike was located in a roadside embankment not far from the home. It was damaged, but identifiable. But here's the detail that stopped investigators cold. Her helmet, the one she would have been wearing on the same ride, turned up 8 miles away from the bike. 8 miles. You don't end up with a bike in one location and a helmet 8 miles in a different direction because of a crash. That's not physics. That's not how accidents work. From that moment forward, deputies weren't looking at a lost hiker or an injured mountain biker. They were looking at something far more serious. Barry Morphew was reached by phone while he was still in the Denver area and drove back to Salida. Body camera footage captured his arrival at the scene, and investigators would later spend a significant amount of time analyzing his behavior from those early hours. He was emotional, visibly upset, asking rapid questions. But within moments of arriving, before anyone had suggested any theory, before any evidence had been processed, Barry asked deputies, "Was it a mountain lion?" Now, that might not sound alarming on its own, but investigators took note. Nobody had said anything about an animal. There were no claw marks on the bike, no blood, no drag patterns consistent with a predator. The deputy hadn't mentioned wildlife, yet Barry's first instinct, apparently, was to suggest a mountain lion attack. He would bring it up again later in the same conversation, unprompted. When deputies later reviewed the body camera footage in detail, that moment stood out. Barry also gave deputies a full account of his day. He said he had been at the worksite near Denver all morning, working a big job, and had barely thought to check his phone because he was heads down on the project. It sounded reasonable. It sounded like a guy with a clear alibi. But when investigators talked to Barry's coworker, the man who was supposed to be working the same job, the story began to unravel almost immediately. According to that coworker, the Denver job wasn't even scheduled to begin until Sunday evening. Barry had departed on his own initiative, hours ahead of schedule without notifying his colleague. When the coworker eventually arrived in Denver, he discovered that Barry hadn't brought any of the necessary tools or equipment for the job. And surveillance footage from the area told an even starker story. Barry Morphew had spent fewer than 30 minutes at the actual job site for the entire day. So where was he for the rest of it? According to investigators, he spent hours driving around the Denver metro area. And they allege he wasn't sightseeing. Authorities say he was making stops at public trash cans, apparently disposing of items, though exactly what those items were has not been fully confirmed in court documents. The alibi, the work trip, the early departure, the missing equipment, none of it held up. Barry and his co-worker had planned to stay at a hotel near the job site, and according to reporting from the Daily Mail at the time, when the co-worker visited the room where Barry had been staying, he noticed something unusual, the smell of chlorine. Hotel staff confirmed this was strange. The hotel didn't have a pool. Their cleaning staff didn't use chlorine-based products as part of their standard room turnover. There was no obvious explanation for why that smell would be present in Barry's room. Keep that detail tucked away for a moment. We'll come back to it. Because when Suzanne's remains were eventually found years later, the condition of her bones would raise some very specific questions about whether bleach or a similar chemical had been used at some point in the handling of her body. Back at the Morphew home, investigators were conducting a thorough search. One of the more seemingly mundane details from that search would later become one of the most significant pieces of physical evidence in the entire case. Inside the dryer, deputies found a needle cap, the kind used to load a tranquilizer dart gun. Investigators believe it came from clothing Barry had washed, that it had been in the pocket of something he wore and ended up in the drum of the dryer when the laundry was run. A tranquilizer dart cap in the dryer, at the home of a woman who had vanished under circumstances that had no explanation. They also collected a pair of padded mountain biking shorts from the house. This matters because Suzanne went out for a mountain bike ride that morning, and these were the type of shorts she would typically wear on such a ride. Why were they at home? Investigators wondered the same thing. She could have owned more than one pair, but combined with everything else, it was another thread being pulled. Barry had told investigators early on that his marriage was in good shape. He and Suzanne were solid, he said. Happy, no serious problems. Investigators would discover this was not true. When they obtained cell phone records, they found something damning. Barry had deleted a text message thread between himself and Suzanne, but the deletion wasn't complete. What remained, including a screenshot of a message from Suzanne, made the state of the marriage unmistakably clear. She told him in no uncertain terms that she was done, that she hadn't cared about his personal life in years, that they needed to resolve things and move on. Beyond the texts, investigators also learned that Suzanne had been involved in a romantic relationship with someone who lived outside of Colorado. This was not a marriage coasting through rough times. This was a marriage that had effectively ended, at least emotionally, long before Mother's Day 2020. For investigators trying to establish motive, this was significant. A husband who allegedly knew his wife wanted out, who allegedly deleted evidence of that knowledge, who allegedly gave a false account of his relationship to police. If investigators were building a theory about what happened to Suzanne, they now had a plausible reason why someone might want her gone. Cell phone data added another layer of detail to the timeline. Records showed that on May 9th, the day before Suzanne was reported missing, Barry's phone went dark at 2:47 in the afternoon. It didn't come back on until after 10 that night. Suzanne's own devices showed her last digital activity at around 2:11 that afternoon. The overlap in those timelines is not subtle. Barry's phone then went silent again just before 4:30 the following morning, May 10th, the day he said he left for Denver. It came back online around 5:37 a.m. as he headed north. But investigators also flagged activity data from Barry's truck between approximately 3:25 and 3:49 that same morning, a window during which Barry claimed he was asleep. The truck data told a different story. Based on this accumulation of evidence, investigators moved to arrest Barry Morphew in May 2021, roughly a year after Suzanne's disappearance. The theory prosecutors were reportedly prepared to present was specific and disturbing. That Barry had used a tranquilizer gun to sedate Suzanne, pursued her as the drug took effect, killed her, and then disposed of her body, all while setting up the appearance that he had been 2 hours away on a work trip the entire time. His daughters were both out of town. There were no witnesses. The case appeared to be moving forward. A trial was set, and then it all fell apart, not because the evidence was weak, but because of what happened inside the prosecutor's office. In April 2022, just before Barry was scheduled to stand trial, the prosecution announced it could not proceed. The reason was a serious failure of legal process. The district attorney, Linda Stanley, had not turned over required evidence to the defense, and several of the state's key witnesses had been barred from testifying as a result. This was a catastrophic prosecutorial error, and the consequences were severe. Linda Stanley was ultimately disbarred. The murder charges against Barry Morphew were dropped, but the judge did make one notable statement when the charges were dismissed. The door was not permanently closed. Prosecutors could refile if circumstances changed. Barry Morphew walked out of that courtroom a free man. For more than 3 years after Suzanne vanished, her family had no definitive answers, no confirmed cause of death, no remains, just an open wound and a man who had walked away from a murder charge on a legal technicality. That changed on September 22nd, 2023. On that date, Suzanne Morphew's remains were discovered in a shallow grave located just a few hundred feet off a rural road. Investigators were able to recover the majority of her skeletal remains, along with some personal items, including a medical cancer port, the kind used to deliver medication intravenously, and the cycling clothes she was known to have been wearing the day she disappeared. But the condition of everything raised immediate questions. The bones were described as significantly bleached. Now, bleaching of bones can result from prolonged sun exposure, but forensic experts also noted that chemical bleaching, using products like chlorine bleach, can produce similar results. Remember that hotel room smell. Remember that investigators had never been able to explain it. And then there was the clothing. The cycling gear found with her remains showed no evidence of decomposition consistent with her having been wearing it when her body broke down. This suggested to investigators, and to the forensic anthropologist who examined the site, that the clothing may have been placed on or near her remains after the fact. Furthermore, the forensic analysis of the burial site itself indicated this was likely not the original location where Suzanne's body had decomposed. Evidence pointed toward the remains having been moved and redeposited at the location where they were ultimately found. In short, someone had allegedly gone to significant lengths to stage what was found in that grave. When investigators ran toxicological analysis on Suzanne's remains, they found traces of a specific chemical compound. Its name, BAM, a sedative mixture primarily used to tranquilize large animals. It's not a household substance. You can't buy it online or pick it up at a feed store. In 2020, there was a single company in the entire United States that manufactured it, and obtaining it required a prescription from a licensed veterinarian. The discovery of BAM in Suzanne's remains immediately brought investigators back to that tranquilizer dart cap found in the Morphew's dryer. The theory they had been building suddenly had a very specific, very traceable chemical foundation. Here's where the investigation took a turn that prosecutors describe as the linchpin of their case. Before moving to Colorado, Barry Morphew had worked as a deer farmer in Indiana. In that capacity, entirely legally for entirely legitimate farming purposes, he had obtained a BAM prescription. He had purchased the compound in 2018 before the family relocated to Salida. Investigators then pulled prescription and purchase records for BAM across all of the surrounding counties in Colorado, the entire geographic region surrounding where the Morphews lived. The results were extraordinary. From 2017 through 2020, not a single private citizen and not a single private business in any of those surrounding counties had purchased BAM, with the exception of local park services. Not one. In an entire region of Colorado, the only private individual known to have possessed that compound at that time was Barry Morphew. Prosecutors put it plainly in the indictment, and they put part of it in bold. When Suzanne Morphew disappeared, only one private citizen in that entire area of the state had access to BAM, the same BAM found in her remains. A grand jury reviewed this evidence and issued an indictment. Barry Morphew was charged with murder for the second time. Between the 2022 dismissal of charges and his 2025 rearrest, Barry Morphew had not been sitting still. He relocated to Arizona, and according to newly unsealed court documents, he did not arrive there as Barry Morphew. He arrived as someone else entirely. The woman he eventually moved in with, they met in December 2024 and were living together by May 2025, told investigators that the man she knew had introduced himself as Lee Moore. Not Barry, not Morphew. Lee Moore, a clean slate. A new identity in a new state. And it's not hard to understand the logic, even if the motive is unsettling. A basic internet search of Barry Morphew would return years of news coverage about a missing wife, a murder arrest, a high-profile case. For someone trying to start fresh, whether out of guilt, self-preservation, or simply the desire to move on, assuming a different name was a way to keep all of that buried. Colorado investigators had been watching. In February 2025, they contacted their counterparts in Arizona and requested assistance in tracking an individual living in their state. A warrant was obtained to place a GPS tracker on Barry's vehicle. Months of surveillance followed. Then, 5 days before his arrest, something unexpected happened. Barry allegedly told the woman he was living with his real name. He also told her that his wife had been kidnapped in Colorado. 5 days, not weeks, not months. 5 days before law enforcement moved in. Whether he knew he was under surveillance, whether something spooked him, whether he simply couldn't maintain the fiction any longer, we don't know. But the timing is striking. On a day in June 2025, Barry Morphew was pulled over during a traffic stop in Arizona. He was taken into custody without incident and transported back to Colorado to face a second murder charge. When Barry made his first court appearance back in Colorado, observers noted that he smiled broadly at someone in the audience. At least one of his daughters has remained publicly supportive of her father throughout the entire ordeal, and it's believed she was in the courtroom that day. The question of bail was contentious. Prosecutors requested conditions that would keep Barry confined, arguing, among other things, that his history of relocating across state lines and living under an assumed identity made him a clear flight risk. The court initially set bond at $3 million cash only, an amount designed to be nearly impossible to meet. But that bond was later converted to a surety bond, which opened a more realistic path to release. Barry posted bond and was released in September 2025. He is currently living outside of jail, subject to electronic monitoring. His defense team has made clear they intend to fight these charges vigorously, and one of the first major battles has already been waged, over timing. The trial was originally slated for October 2025, but the defense requested a continuance, citing the sheer volume of evidence they need time to review and analyze. The prosecution pushed back, with Suzanne's siblings publicly expressing concern about further delays. They noted the emotional weight of watching this case stretch on year after year, and they raised the flight risk issue again given Barry's prior relocation and identity change. The judge sided with the defense. As of now, the trial may not begin until mid-2027, more than 7 years after Suzanne Morphew went missing on Mother's Day 2020. Attorneys are expected back in court next month to finalize the timeline. I want to take a moment before we close out here, because the Morphew case isn't just a collection of shocking details, though there are plenty of those. What this case really illustrates is how difficult it is to successfully prosecute a crime when there's no witness, no surveillance footage of the act itself, and the accused is careful enough to plan around the obvious pitfalls. Barry Morphew allegedly drove 2 hours away from his home. He allegedly established a work alibi. He allegedly disposed of materials in public trash cans across a metro area. He allegedly washed his clothes. And for 3 years, there was no body. What undid all of that allegedly careful planning, if the prosecution's theory is correct, was chemistry. A veterinary sedative purchased years earlier in Indiana. A compound so specific and so controlled that when investigators pulled the purchase records for an entire region of Colorado, there was only one name on the list. The kind of detail that can't be explained away, can't be blamed on contamination or coincidence, can't be dismissed with an alibi. You can plan for a lot of things. Apparently, it's harder to plan for a paper trail tied to a tranquilizer dart cap left in your dryer. The next court date is coming up soon, and we will be covering every major development in this case as it moves toward trial. If you're watching this and you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe. This is exactly the kind of long-form true crime coverage we dig into every week. Drop a comment below and tell me which detail in this case hit you hardest. Was it the BAM prescription records, the hotel room smell, the fake name in Arizona? Because honestly, every time I think I've landed on the most shocking part of this story, I find another one underneath it. We'll see you in the next one.